When I was 20 years old, God called me to plant a church, and He called me to plant a church in a city. Now, I grew up in a small town about an hour from that city. Small town, the tallest building was 2 or 3 stories high. But in this big city, there were skyscrapers. And we'd gone to that city and gone up in the tallest of the buildings and looked out over the city, and I got to tell you, I was intimidated. I was filled with fear. Went back to where we were staying that night, and I took a walk, and I'm like, God, I can't do this. This is too big for me. The giant of fear and intimidation was towering over me. And God said, I defeat giants. And He took me to 1 Samuel chapter 17, where we read about David and Goliath. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not say with a sword or a spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands. You see, David was just a little guy, and he was facing a big giant, and that's exactly how I felt. But I learned something valuable that day that I've never forgot. God is bigger than any giant that you may think. David ran out into that battle because in his mind, that giant wasn't too big to hit. That giant was too big to miss. He couldn't miss taking down that giant because he was a big target. David understood that one small person plus one infinite God equals big enough for anything you're facing. Well, a few years later, we actually started that church, and God had given me a team of other people to help start it. God had provided, between my wife working and folks sending in money for me to not have to work full-time. God provided. Our church started it with 12 people in my basement and grew to 50 people for our first worship service, to 100 and some people at the end of the first year, and then 200, and then 250, and then 300, and kept growing every year until that church had 2,000 people and started several other churches. That's a big thing God did, not because I'm a big person, not even because I had a big faith, but because I had a faith in a big person, a bigger person, God, and God is big enough. Some of you are living in fear right now. You're living under the giant of fear is intimidating you, the giant of depression, the giant of sin you can't seem to break, the giant of addiction, the giant of anger. I want you to know God's big enough to defeat all those giants. He's big enough to take down all those giants. Some of you live in constant defeat because you live under the giant of finances and not having enough. You know, I know when you're doing God's thing, God always gives you just enough. Your health is holding you back. Well, I've seen God. I went through 3 years when I was in chronic illness, and I couldn't do very many things. I could lead a leadership meeting. I could preach on Sundays, and I could study and pray, and that's all I could do. But God is so big. Our church grew during those 3 years. My health was not a drawback because God's bigger than my health. Your job seems to be a hindrance to you. Well, God's big enough to either change your job, provide for you without that job, or give you a better job. Education, you say, I don't have enough. Well, with God, He knows everything. God can give you enough. God provided for my wife and I to go all the way through college and graduate school without one penny of expense because God is big enough. All of your giants, add them all up. Put them all together. They're still just tiny compared to an infinite God who's bigger than any giant you're going to face. You can have the faith to defeat giants if you put your faith in an infinite God.